Actually, I'll introduce my colleague, Professor Gabriela Arredondo, Associate Professor of Latin American and Latino Studies. Thank you for serving as moderator.
Thank you, Kat. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to be part of this incredibly stimulating group of scholars. It's my lovely task to introduce our speakers for this panel in particular, and then I will open it up for questions after they've all done their presentations. Our first one is going to be Lisa Cacho, and she is with the Latino Studies Department and Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And she will be talking to us from a paper she's entitled De Facto Status Crime, Legitimizing Violence, Legalizing Discrimination. Our second speaker is going to be Felicity Amaya Schaeffer, here from UCSC in Feminist Studies. And the title of her talk is Remote Identification, Criminalizing the Hidden Intent of Migrant Embodiment. Our final speaker is going to be Susan Coutin, Anthropology and Criminology, Law and Society at UC Irvine, who will be speaking to us from her paper called Deferral. So without further ado, please help me welcoming them to our panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Kat Ramirez for inviting me here today and the Chicano Latino Research Center for sponsoring this important conference. I'm really honored and excited to be a part of this panel. I wanted to start my comments today with a quote from Donald Trump. When Business Insider pressed Trump on how he would deport 11 million people, concerned that such an action would clearly overburden the courts, Trump responded with, quote, "They say you have to go through a huge legal process. You don't. They're illegal. If somebody walks in, they don't bring them to court, they send them back. If somebody walks in from Mexico or from wherever they come from and they come into the country, security guards bring them back. You don't go through 10 years of courts and stuff," end quote. We'd like to dismiss Trump because his racism and bigotry are so offensive that it's hard to take him seriously. And we'd like to do the same with the crazy ideas he espouses, such as bypassing immigration courts and immigrants' rights in deportation procedures. But it's important to keep in mind that many of his outright racist plans are not necessarily illegal. His plans to place predominantly Muslim immigrant communities under more surveillance are not really illegal because it is not unconstitutional to racially profile non-citizens. His plans to restrict or exclude Muslims from immigrating have been happening already since NSEERS, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, which was never dismantled. Although people are no longer required to comply with it, it remains intact and can be resurrected. And his plan to bypass the court system to deport unauthorized immigrants, although not legal, does already happen extra-legally. And in fact, it did happen to the father of one of my students, who learned her father was undocumented, and it was because he never updated his paperwork, as they crossed a state border on their way to a family vacation. Her father was detained in jail and then brought to the border and just dropped off in Mexico. All the lawyers they hired explained that although what happened was not legal, there was nothing they could do because her father did not have legal standing in the US because he was in Mexico. Although immigrants can be punished for crimes retroactively, it seems they cannot retroactively invoke rights that they might have been entitled to, even as unlawful residents of the United States. I began with Trump because his offensive comments and his racist proposals are not aberrant to US law, nor are they that far removed from American norms, morals, values, and ethics. It's not just that people support Trump, it's also that supporters of undocumented immigrants are limited in what we can say and how we can voice our support. Trump categorically criminalizes undocumented immigrants and proposes to deport all undocumented immigrants without regard for their predicaments, their families, their experiences, their contributions to the United States, or their rights of due process. This puts us in a position to repudiate criminality, to attempt to delink criminality from illegality. This pressure is only exacerbated when Trump equates undocumented immigrants with murderers and rapists. But I want to suspend the impulse to characterize undocumented immigrants as uncomplicated, utterly innocent victims, because it's just not the reality for many of my students and their families. In other words, rather than disavowing criminality assumed inherent in illegality, I'm more interested in rethinking it. So I'll be talking today about a concept, de facto status crime, which I've tried to theorize in my book entitled Social Death, Racialized Rightlessness, and the Criminalization of the Unprotected. In the United States, status crimes, or de jure status crimes, an actual status crime, crime of being, they're mostly unenforceable, and for the most part, they're considered unconstitutional. A person's actions or behavior or conduct can be illegal, but a person's status is not supposed to be. In general, it's you can't. So you can be charged, for instance, with possessing marijuana, but to arrest someone for being a drug addict or for being addicted to drugs is considered cruel and unusual punishment and therefore unconstitutional. So I add de facto to status crime to emphasize that the criminalization of status is a reality, in fact, for the most economically and politically vulnerable populations, even if this is supposedly unconstitutional in law or de jure. I find it a particularly useful term for analyzing discourses of undocumented immigration because undocumented immigrants are primarily criminalized based on status as unlawful aliens. So a de facto status crime refers to the fact that a person does not need to do anything at all to commit a status crime because the person's status is considered and treated as the offense in and of itself. So all of Trump's comments on immigration and his proposals for immigration reform expose that being an undocumented immigrant is a de facto status crime. But again, Trump only makes obvious what has already been implemented. He draws on dominant ideologies that have already been used to justify recent deportations. So for instance, when introducing the Priority Enforcement Program, President Obama and his administration made a distinction between criminal immigrants who deserve immediate deportation and immigrant families who deserve deportation relief. He said his action will target, quote, felons, not families, criminals, not children, gang members, not a mom who's working hard to provide for her kids, end quote. And the wording here is important because Obama is contrasting statuses and identities, but not behaviors. Felon, criminal, gang member, and he contrasts these with images of respectable domesticity and heteronormativity, family, child, mom. But I've worked with students whose undocumented fathers are felons, who have been gang members since they were children, whose undocumented mothers work hard, but not always through the most legally legitimate ways. Furthermore, crossing the border itself without authorization or improper entry is in fact considered a crime and estimated to be the case for about 60% of the undocumented population. In fact, recent border crossers, according to this priority enforcement, are a priority 1 deportation. So I use the term de facto status crime to name people who are seen as and treated as criminal without regard as to whether or not they actually committed a crime. It's as if they're criminalizing the certain potential to commit a crime. The person's status is the offense in and of itself. And so by status, I mean a person's relationship to U.S. legal apparatuses. So not just a quote-unquote illegal alien, but also statuses like gang member or a terrorist suspect. These are statuses that are criminalized and are treated as such, whether or not the people who occupy those statuses actually do anything. I also use the term de facto status crime because I think it captures the ways in which criminalized conduct has been intimately linked to the use of status to refer to identity categories, such as race, gender, ethnicity, nationality, sexuality, and class. Because status assumes embodiment and fixity, de facto status crime captures the many ways in which people and places of color have become necessary signifiers to recognize illegality or criminality, thus making certain behaviors as not only illegal, but also seemingly innate, inherent, and inherited. To explain how certain bodies are marked as disposable and violable, as legitimate targets of state and vigilante violence, I find it necessary to examine the ways in which law work to affix assumptions about behavior onto bodies. Historically, law has criminalized the recreational activities, the survival economies, and the intimate relationships of people of color, so that the status of being of color was inseparable from the conduct assumed to be criminal. Before anti-racist legislation was implemented following the civil rights movement, law criminalized and reified marginalized identities as statuses. Being colored was a status that formed the basis for exclusionary, discriminatory, and regulatory laws. In other words, historically, racial identity was a legal status that was regulated and named by law, like Jim Crow laws or Chinese exclusion. Jim Crow laws were based on the status of being Black. Chinese laborers were excluded from immigrating based on the status of being working-class Chinese. What we call identity categories in the contemporary era, race, national origin, religious affiliation, or sexual identification, functioned historically as excludable statuses in segregation, naturalization, and immigration law. Today's laws that criminalize conduct contingent on status have inherited this history. For example, we're not supposed to make being a prostitute illegal because it's unconstitutional to make a status a crime, but the act of prostituting oneself can be a crime, and is in many states. The problem is that this distinction doesn't always work because the common sense definition of prostitution is a sexual act with a prostitute. Right? So if a secretary sleeps with his boss to get a promotion, that's not necessarily seen as something that you're going to go to jail for. Hence, criminality itself is linked more to status than to crime. So in my book, I argue that this has happened in general with both criminality and illegality, that people only recognize criminal activity if there is a Black or brown body attached to the action. In 2005, there were 2 photos of looting that several internet bloggers had juxtaposed during the coverage of Hurricane Katrina. One photo was of a white couple with the caption, quote, "2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store," end quote. The other photo was of a young Black man with the caption, quote, "A young man wades through chest-deep flood water after looting a grocery store," end quote. And people were really angry. Most of the outrage reflected what I feel like might be a knee-jerk reaction to being stereotyped, which was to point out how racist the photojournalists were. But what I argue is that this was actually less about stereotyping and more about how people needed race in order to see crime. The photojournalists saw in action. They saw people taking groceries from flooded stores, and they interpreted that action. They gave meaning to that action based on the race of the actors, on their assumed identities, on their historical legal statuses. For the white actors, the action looked like finding. But with the Black actors, the action looked like looting. In other words, the crime itself was unrecognizable without a Black body. Criminal activity itself was unseeable as criminal without a Black body. This example in particular is so disturbing because when the actors were white, the same exact action is interpreted as not a crime at all. And in fact, it's evidence of human survival and ingenuity, as a model for the rest of us to aspire to should we find ourselves in a similar tragedy. Yet not only does status work to criminalize non-criminals, status also works to decriminalize violent lawbreakers. So I'm going to give another example from my book. In one chapter, I talk about a group of 8 white teenagers in San Diego who brutally assaulted 5 Mexican migrant workers. The teenagers tortured the workers for 3 hours. They riddled one worker's face and body with BBs. They tried to set his home on fire. When another migrant stepped in to help, they beat him unconscious. They beat him so badly, they thought they might have killed him. So instead of calling a hospital, they dragged his body behind the bushes to leave him for dead. Although their actions were sometimes described as gang-like by media, their actions were not legally defined as gang crime. This is because gang crime is not defined by whether or not the crimes are committed in a gang-like fashion. It's defined by who commits the crime and who benefits from the crime committed by status. In fact, it was the boys' status that protected them from the social and legal consequences of their behaviors. Their relationship to U.S. law was one of value, privilege, and entitlement. When media elicited sympathy for these young men, reporters focused on the teenagers' status. One of the mothers, Deborah Mandulay, explained to the Union Tribune, San Diego's major newspaper, that she voted for Proposition 21, which was the proposition that made it possible for her son to be charged and sentenced as an adult. She voted for it because she didn't realize that the California Penal Code would be amended in ways that would affect the youth who were not in a gang. She told reporters that she thought Proposition 21 was, quote, directed at incorrigible young criminals involved in serious sex offenses and murder, end quote. In contrast, her own son, Morgan Mandalay, she described as, quote, an obedient little boy, a terrific kid who's been no trouble at all to raise, end quote. So she and the reporters who quote her avoid juxtaposing serious crimes, such as sex offense and murder, with Morgan's equally serious hate crimes, which encompass racially motivated robbery, torture, assault, and elder abuse. So for instance, she doesn't say, I thought the proposition punished sex offenses and murderers, not teenagers that steal money from migrants, then violently assault them and torture them for hours while shouting racial epithets. That's not what she says. So what they're doing is they're juxtaposing two non-parallel images to underscore Mandulay's status, right, represented through his bodily difference, as different from the bodies of youth of color that the proposition targeted, which was gang members, and at the same time, it subtly sidesteps the fact that his behavior is actually comparably criminal. Portraying Morgan as a terrific kid and an obedient little boy shifts the focus from his conduct, committing hate crimes, to his body and to his status as a privileged suburban teenager. And this happens throughout the news reports of the hate crime, even when the news accounts recounted the 8 young men's crimes unsympathetically, right? They always manage to talk about the teenagers in sympathetic ways, and they do so by disconnecting the boys' behaviors from their bodies. This allows audiences to feel repulsed by the crimes committed and yet still feel compassion for the perpetrators who committed them. So it's like saying that the behaviors do need to be punished, but not the boys who behaved that way. No one challenged the absolute wrongness of the acts the teenagers committed, and yet, even though their actions were by all accounts undoubtedly wrong, the press still wondered whether those violent actions actually warranted adult punishment. Journalists elicited sympathy for Mandalay and empathy for his family, but representing him as an unintended casualty of Proposition 21, misrecognized by criminal law as a criminal. So in this way, the articles about Mandalay sought to elicit sympathy irrespective of the teenager's guilt or innocence. So what I'm trying to emphasize with this example is that decriminalization depends more on a person's status than on the degree of his or her criminal culpability, the violence that was committed, or the maliciousness of a person's intent. Norman T. Feather's work on the social psychology of justice helps us think about why the emphasis on status is effective for enabling privileged, socially valued lawbreakers to sidestep the legal and social consequences of their behaviors. As Feather explains, justice is not a neutral concept applied to all people equally, but one that depends on the subtle distinctions between entitlement and deservingness. So he gives us an example of inheritance as a way to think about these differences. So if someone is terminally ill, has a terminally ill friend and spends a lot of time caring for that person, any inheritance she might receive after her friend passes away would be seen as well-deserved. Whereas that same friend's estranged nephew, who maybe received a much larger share of inheritance, even though he never called and never visited, would still be seen as entitled to that money simply because of his social and legal relationship to the deceased. So entitlement is grounded within a group's socially recognized rights, right, as conferred through their status, while deservingness is founded upon an evaluative structure that puts people's actions and the outcomes of their actions constantly under scrutiny and always up for judgment. And this, too, is determined by a person's status in society and their relationship to U.S. law. The San Diego teenagers targeted men they believed had committed de facto status crimes, men whose racial, ethnic, and class identities associated them with crime and with criminality, with an illegal status that they did not, in fact, occupy. And this illegal status, undocumented immigrant as illegal alien. To the young privileged men, the workers' bodies themselves were evidence of crime. And as criminal in being, the workers were seen not only as vulnerable to ridicule and robbery, but also vulnerable to being intimidated, beaten, dragged behind bushes, and left for dead. So therefore, even though illegal alien is not a legal term and to be undocumented is not a crime, but a civil infraction that you cannot be criminally punished for, to be an illegal alien is essentially a de facto status crime. In fact, most unsympathetic criminalized populations are subjected to laws based on their relationship to US law or their status, like, again, illegal aliens, gang members, people suspected of terrorism, and therefore they're unable to comply with the quote-unquote rule of law. Because US law targets their bodies and their beings, not their behavior, they're denied not only the illusion of democratic participation, they don't get to vote on the laws that affect them, but they're even denied the ability to abide by the rule of law. Because if you're an undocumented immigrant, it's impossible to follow the rule of law in the United States because yourself, your being, your body is constructed as the crime. All the things you do that are legal for everyone else are constructed and treated as if they were criminal acts: going to school, getting medical care, working a 9-to-5 job. If you're an undocumented immigrant, the only way to respect the rule of law in the country where you live, the United States, is to remove yourself from that country. But that's kind of ironic, right? Because once you don't live in that country, you don't really have an obligation to follow the rule of law. Like, I don't have an obligation to follow the rule of law in Canada since I live in the United States. For undocumented immigrants, then, they are criminalized regardless as to whether or not they constantly abide and consistently abide by all the laws that regulate behavior. And those are the only laws that actually any of us can follow. But they can't follow laws that make their bodies or their being illegal. I want to provide one last example from a sympathetic perspective that highlights how we're limited in what and how we can support undocumented immigrants if we can't let go of the need to decriminalize them or to delink criminality from illegality. In a sympathetic expose about the undocumented, unaccompanied minors from Central America, journalist Sonia Nazario details several unforgivable examples of gang violence because she sees the child victims of gang violence as themselves criminal too. So what she wants to do is represent the unaccompanied minors as uncomplicated victims whose innocence is not called into question, probably because she admittedly believes in the US rule of law, but also feels like undocumented children who are victims of gang violence should be an exception somehow, betraying her belief that even children victimized by violent transnational gangs are not necessarily entitled to rights, but maybe could be deserving of them. She differentiates children who are fleeing gang violence from undeserving children who seek a better life economically. Quote, "Many Americans, myself included, believe in deporting unlawful immigrants, but see a different imperative with refugees," end quote. By representing these children as refugees rather than immigrants, these children's acts of law-breaking, crossing the border without authorization, can be considered symptomatic of their victimhood and their disempowerment, rather than as evidence of their initiative and ingenuity, their resourcefulness and survivability. For Nazario, not all children deserve to stay in the United States. Quote, "Of course, many migrant children come for economic reasons and not because they fear for their lives. In those cases, they should quickly be deported if they have at least one parent in their country of origin," end quote. So because she can't reconcile her belief that undocumented immigrants, children or not, are inherently unlawful and should be deported, hence having committed de facto status crimes, she tries to narrate children who have suffered from gang violence as refugees rather than immigrants. Essentially, she's encouraging us to understand some children as having a different legal status that's not fully disconnected, but also not automatically fused to criminality, like the term illegal alien. So I'm trying to encourage us to think about how to talk about illegality without disavowing criminality, precisely because doing so runs the risk of supporting, or at least maybe not challenging to the best of our abilities, some of the harshest punishments and penalties of immigration law, which depend upon us believing in criminalization. And this is because people who occupy legally vulnerable and criminalized statuses are not just excluded from justice. Criminalized populations and the places where they live form the foundation of the US legal system, imagined to be the reason why the justice system exists. I say they are the foundation of law and not outside the law or excluded from law, because to be outside the law suggests that eventual inclusion is possible. When immigration law excluded people of particular races and national origins from immigrating, those laws could be changed so that they could no longer target certain races, but But the changes could not fundamentally alter the criminalized statuses that the laws themselves produced. So for instance, Chinese exclusion, 1882, produced the Chinese illegal alien. Repealing Chinese exclusion, 1943, enabled more immigrants from China to enter the United States legally, but it did not change the vulnerable legal status of the illegal alien. The illegal or the unlawful alien is a status that forms the foundation of immigration law, and therefore the unlawful alien cannot be included or incorporated into immigration or naturalization law. Laws that have tried to address the problem of having an undocumented rightless population have only been able to make exceptions. Recent proposals for the DREAM Act also propose to create exceptions to current immigration law, for instance, by giving a path to legalization to undocumented college students and undocumented persons who serve the military. But the DREAM Act proposals do not address the fundamental problem of immigration law, that it basically creates a permanently rightless status. So to say that some groups form the foundation for law is to say that law is dependent upon the permanence of certain groups' criminalization. These populations are excluded from the ostensibly democratic processes that legitimate U.S. law, yet they are expected to unambiguously accept and unequivocally uphold a legal and political system that depends on the unquestioned permanency of their rightlessness. Criminalization justifies people's ineligibility to legal personhood, but for undocumented immigrants, the de facto status crime of being an illegal alien is so disempowering because unlawful presence is a civil, not a criminal matter. And that's actually quite important, that unlawful presence is as a civil infraction. It's not a criminal matter because it names deportation as a civil penalty rather than a criminal punishment. This denies undocumented immigrants criminal protections, such as the ability to contest a cruel and unusual punishment. These overlapping injustices enable proposals like Trump's deportation plan, because de facto status crimes position undocumented immigrants as criminals who can be dealt with extra legally, as criminals without the rights and the constitutional protections of criminal defendants. Hence, in this way, our legal system necessitates, requires, and naturalizes discrimination against undocumented immigrants. In other words, it's not just that they have no legal recourse or protection. They're not just excluded from law. It's that our legal system itself, 1, makes it impossible to address their needs, 2, legitimates and legalizes discrimination against them, and 3, demands that everyone else discriminate against them too, so that discrimination against certain people seems like a responsible citizen's civic duty. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming and for such stimulating talks. I'm really glad that I'm coming after Lisa's talk because I think this is going to tie in really well. And I think I should start saying just a teeny story about Trump. My daughter and I saw a Trump piñata in front of a Latino store the other day, and we just kind of like, at first we were like, why? And then we looked at each other and we started laughing because, of course, like the idea or the image of people, you know, Latinos especially, just bashing Trump was very satisfying. So it has nothing to do with my talk, but. So identity theft is currently labeled the fastest growing crime of the 21st century. The rising scale of ID theft as a proliferating crime and terrorist threat alters how populations, borders, and transit sites are governed. Rather than merely checking documents, who are you? Current security approaches turn to biometric surveillance technologies and deception detection, or verifying the relationship between the document and the body. Are you who you say you are? The ID document is a technology that's moved from a textual representation of the self, document as me, to one that relies on biometric data to verify and stabilize the truth of the body. The document is me. And as biometrics increasingly replace documentation, these technologies recycle the colonial science of anthropometry such that bones, voices, DNA, gait, tattoos, and fingerprints serve as identity documents, and for some, a unique signature. It's the ID document's deadly liveliness as a technology that sorts between those with authorization versus those coded as threat. In the second stage of security, the imperative to predict who has a propensity to commit harm has unleashed a legal scientific approach to surveillance that envisions the body as evidence, unlocking the secret interiority of the body and its affects that confers one's deviant ontology even before an illegal act is committed. So in this paper, I'm interested in exploring how surveillance and law shape migration control across bodies and mass transit zones, what Europe now refers to as hotspots, or key arrival points where more rigorous systems for screening and fingerprinting migrants and refugees are implemented. In these quote-unquote crisis zones, sovereignty has become automated and redistributed across multiple bodies and geopolitical borders. In these exceptional zones, law and resources from multiple countries collide. And here I'm thinking of Europe, Israel, and the US, and in particular Arizona. So despite claims by the Department of Defense to shifting military and intelligence from nation states to individuals, focusing on the logic of migrant surveillance dispersed across hotspots refuses to sever a body caught in the surveillant gaze from a colonial geography lit up with red dots splatted across a screen or map. Oh, thank you. So do I just go to the next? So I'm just going to kind of give you some images of different ways of thinking about the hotspot. These zones of excessive activity already see certain bodies through typologies of abnormality. So we have sort of cancer hotspots. Hotspots are more broadly defined by an excess of heat, affect, technological connectivity. So, and this is kind of brain scans and crime hotspots, refugee hotspots. I'll come back to some of these, and even Wi-Fi hotspots. Technological connectivity, disease, illicit commerce, and erratic behavior, where individual bodies become racialized through the process, I'm arguing, of massification, where bodies and borders are visualized already through this optic of crisis and the need to control mass bodies in motion. A hotspot's defined through a colonial imaginary, a small area or region with a relatively hot temperature in comparison to its surroundings, also volcanic activity geologically defined, as a zone of commerce and security, a place of significant activity or danger, an infectious zone of the body, and a technological hub where internet access achieves mass communication across other hot-wired spots. What unites these disparate definitions is the exceptional heat or activity that constitutes alerted attention as a zone of profit, connectivity, and threat, in need of state, legal, medical, and technological intervention. So here I'm going to draw from research and interviews that I did in Tucson, Arizona, where I toured the University of Arizona's Border Tech Park, where startup companies bring their new border surveillance technologies and test them out. And I also interviewed scholars associated with the Border Center, where university research and border surveillance commingle. Some of the questions I'm asking here are, how do laws, and I'm thinking in particular of these ID theft laws, and surveillance work together to strip human action from the scene of the crime? So I'm thinking too, as Lisa is, about the ways in which crime has been ontologically wedded to the body. While law and science are segregated in biopolitical accounts of disciplining, punishment, and death, I want to think about their co-constitutive role. Surveillance strips migrants of intention, consciousness, context, and humanity by alienating the body's physiognomy into automated nature, merging the body as a pre-verbal, primitive unconscious with the automation of life and death as a future to happen, authorizing intimate intrusions into migrant bodies and lives through legally sanctioned migrant raids and the turn to supposedly non-intrusive technologies. So I'm trying here to think about the ways in which law gets constituted as the humane approach, just as surveillance technologies are the more humane, less racially biased approach to migration control. And to think about the technologies themselves as already infused with quite violent racialized ways of seeing. So the fetish for deception detection turns the body into this primitive object of knowledge pilfering, as argued by Kim Tallbear, and the testing ground for mass profit and the expansion of a penal economy. The biometric body authorizes these racialized penal structures, what Simone Brown calls an identity industrial complex. Stripping bodies of narration over their own body and thus agency, laws and technologies resurrect a neo-colonial apparatus of evidence that relies on the body to tell the truth of who we are, what we're capable of doing in the future, and who will most likely deviate from social norms and patterns. The body as data converts biology into an archivable document, while documents confirm one's ability to live, securing our biofuturity. Surveillance technologies remake the meanings of the human and non-human in ways that have grave consequences for the separation of the trustworthy populations, those who are transparent, from those who remain hidden, and thus must be rendered visible through technologies that register them as anomalies and thus as threat. In Mark Andrzejewic's book, Infoglut, he argues convincingly that the glut of information in society is meant to overwhelm us, and that such large amounts of information are more accurately deciphered by computer algorithms, relegating humans as outside the power to interpret the world. His analysis raises ethical political dilemmas of a post-human analysis that may collude with the political right that find human testimony, interpretation, and narration to be fallible, more akin to producing fiction than hard scientific results. Furthermore, human interpretation is seen as slow, inaccurate, and even racially or socially biased. Computer algorithms, on the other hand, promise a more accurate and secure mode of sensing and even predicting what eludes interpretation by human cognition. But a lot of these scholars, including Andrzejewicz, are trying to think about the proliferation of surveillance as ubiquitous and sort of being democratized to everyone, equalizing the spread of technologies, then has this way of diminishing the logic of the technologies themselves as entangled in a colonial science that sorts and envisions populations in deeply racial and unequal terms. So, I'm turning both to scholars like Lisa Cacho and many others, Jonathan Inda, who are thinking about law and the ways the laws themselves are leading to the criminalization of migrants, and then also turning to feminist scholars of surveillance and technology who are looking at the technologies themselves to think about the different ways in which race is being constituted. And to think about the very optics of the technologies as already being wrapped up in, or bound up in gendered and racialized ways of seeing. So feminist science scholars are refocusing our lens to the very objects and technologies themselves as imbued with agential capacity. As argued by Karen Barad, technologies enable what materializes in their view, interacting with what can be seen and known into novel ontologies. But what happens, I ask, when the objects themselves and the automation of the data collection usurp more agency than those interacting with the technologies? So in Arizona, the expansion of a high-tech border economy has been enabled by laws that distribute more rights to technological objects than migrants. Arizona was the first state to pass an identity theft law in '96, the same year as the Illegal Immigrant Reform Act, which funded new surveillance technologies and mandated the use of biometrics on IDs by the year 2000. At the same time, the penalties for using false documents increased as identity theft morphed from an administrative charge to a crime in 1998, and then to an aggregated felony and federal crime in 2004. So President Bush signed the 2004 law that shifted ID theft from a victimless financial crime to a violent crime that was popularly depicted as making someone feel, quote, terribly violated. So there were a lot of popular mediums that were showing people saying that when they had their documents stolen, that it made them feel like they were being mugged on the street. So ID theft's association with the violation of another person's being, so now people say, who am I? How do I prove it? Reinforces the ways migrants' very presence in the US unleashes this visceral feeling of violation and theft, entrenching into law a citizenry united by a collective vulnerability that fuels what Neil Ahuja calls dread life, this public who's invested in safety and risk that they feel is both individually and nationally harming them. So escalating the punishment then for these aggregated felonies removed intention from the legislation of harm or criminality, so that it no longer mattered whether a migrant knew that the ID numbers or social security numbers they were using belonged to another real person. And it was no coincidence that these laws were followed by hundreds of random ICE raids. As stipulated by law, any undocumented migrant accused of an aggregated felony is stripped of the right to a court case as they're fast-tracked to detention and deportation. And as these laws pass funding millions of dollars in surveillance for border control, Arizona has also jumped on the opportunity to become a leader in this high-tech market. As with one of the largest federal budgets for intelligence, research, and technological development, the Department of Homeland Security has now created 12 university research centers that focus on the hidden threats, such as terrorists, migrants, diseases, and I always have a hard time saying this, microbial threats to the nation. The surveillance technologies developed at DHS centers, such as Borders at the U of A, include a deception center, contributing to the idea that a safe democracy is based on transparency and surveillance, eradicating the possibility of hidden or unknowable phenomena. Everyone must become documented and thus visible and knowable to the state. So located about 60 miles from the border, Border Tech Park tests drones, smart sensors, and other tracking devices used at border checkpoints, also at nuclear plants and other heavily populated areas such as sporting events. And I want to talk about one device that they've created at the U of A Borders Center called the Avatar. And this is supposedly, let's see if I have it here. Oops, there it is. Okay. This is supposedly a non-invasive computer kiosk that will assist border officials with faster and more accurate deception detection at the Nogales border. Influenced by Paul Ekman's deceit research, scholars now argue that people lie and the cues of deceit are almost impossible for humans to decipher. While human deception may elude detection, scholars find that, quote, liars' bodies betray them. So Ekman trained FBI, TSA officials, and doctors on how to detect lies through a person's microexpressions found in their body language, voice, and facial expressions. His research moved from patients with mental illness whose speech or intentions could not be trusted to those whose malicious intentions would lead them to lie or to fraudulently pass security as regular citizens. Influenced by Freud's detection of the unconscious through slips of the tongue, Ekman finds the hidden signs of deceit are emotional leakages lodged in the unconscious fibers of the body. So we're going here from narration to the body. While the previous iteration of this device, the Avatar, was funded by the Department of Defense, it was a polygraph lie detector test that was encumbered with these straps that they had to attach to somebody's body that would monitor one's heart rate. But now scholars are arguing that it's about multiple remote sensors that will give us a more accurate sense of detecting aberrant vital signs. So this avatar, doesn't look very scary, but it actually uses 50 different invisible scanners that steal data from the body in transit, who approach the avatar by scanning their IDs, and then they answer questions from the automated border official. Is this document you? Why are you crossing the border, etc. So the avatar verifies the truth of narrated responses as it rapidly collects and stores data on a person's vocals and linguistics, tracking movements such as shaking hands, spikes to blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, while recording facial twitches, pupil dilation, and eye gaze. So any deviation from normal body movements, behavior, and stable vital states privilege those with nothing to fear, those who are responsible and trusted against those whose vital signs are churned into algorithms that compute elevated blood pressure with lying, guilt, fear, irrationality, and insecurity. As such, the racialization of safety versus insecurity become known as natural attributes lodged deep in the recess of the molecular truth of the body, rather than produced in the context of state terror. In line with the need to apprehend threat and risk before they happen, migrant intent has morphed from a conscious thought or action, intention, to the unconscious state of heightened affect, automatically computed with risk and threat. So especially appealing about the avatar to researchers has been this cardiovascular sensor that can monitor the body's involuntary movements. Since the body's unconscious truth trumps narrative claims, agency is impossibly woven into what Alan Sekula describes as the deviant body's mute testimony. So he looked at the study of photography during the 19th century that was seen as a more reliable tool for detecting criminality. He argued that a thief may be a good liar, but the photograph did not. So it was also the photograph's ability to archive mass bodies that dramatically altered the practice of criminology, so that police officers could see sort of this massive archive of photographs of criminals that started to move away from the approach to a biographical profile of the criminal and an individual criminal. So in an interview with Elena at the Border Center of the U of A, this avatar technology has a range of uses that they hope will get distributed globally. Some of the scanners have been used to help doctors detect patients who lie while also monitoring patients' vital signs remotely. The Air Force wants to use the avatar's scanners to monitor and transmit soldiers' vital signs from the battlefield. The DHS wants to use it to detect drug smugglers and trafficked persons. At the Nogales, Arizona border, they're looking to differentiate safe from dangerous travelers, goods from bodies and cargo. At Singapore, they want an avatar that can speak 7 languages for the use at a border zone with over 30,000 border crossers. And airports across the US and Romania train personnel on the science of seeing suspicious behavior through these techniques called SPOT, the screening of passengers by observation techniques. And I had to get into this a little bit. So some of their suspicious behavior included things like fidgeting, throat clearing, staring at one's feet, bad body odor, and excessive grooming. But, it seems like a joke, but in 2015, Intercept uncovered these airport officials who were trained to detect behavior indicators to identify supposed terrorists, but found out that they'd spent over $900 million since 2007 to detain undocumented migrants. So of 429 passengers, 14 were detained for being in the country illegally. Very, inefficient system. Others say 100% failure, but they now are testing using gate recognition technology by videotaping people at airports, which is also an interesting tool that has been also really coveted in surveillance technology because it's seen as more remote, less biased, and this is a technology that's been used in the colonies with the advent of ethnographic film. So Felix Renaud interpreted African body movements with this idea that it proved authentic selfhood because their, quote, savage locomotion was closer to nature or untouched by cultural influences. So that, African gait could be seen as unlocking the unconscious truth of racial difference, documenting and measuring evidence of the real or primitive ontologies that predate human intervention. Biometric technologies are also based on, that was the gate, are also based on this idea that instead of basing identity authentication on what someone possesses or what someone knows, biometric identification is based on what one is or how one behaves. But of course, behavior is seen as locked in the body. It's a natural sort of process of how the body moves, stripped of consciousness and tension and agency. So biometrics bypass subjective methods for verifying immigrant identity traditionally categorized by ethnic categorization, class, and kin relations. Current biometrics strip the body of relation to place and social relations while segregating it into parts that determine then the entirety of the person. This metonymic relation between body parts and identity relegates those captured under its gaze not only as non-human, but unable to testify against the evidence of one's natural body. And I'm running out of time, but there's been, what's interesting about the avatar too is that it's used the sensors were developed in the context of Israel by a company called Homeland Security. And they use a combination of these lie detectors, interrogation techniques, biometric data, algorithms to assess the hidden hostile intent of travelers at the in Israel and Palestine, and have these technologies have really helped Israel's laboratory. They've been used within Israel's laboratory of war with Palestinians. And according to Naomi Klein, 9/11 offered Israel the chance to rebrand itself as a 24-hour-a-day showroom, which has managed to turn endless war into a brand asset. And of course, Israel has made billions of dollars on these technologies that are now being sent all over the world. And it helped Israel move out of an economic slump in 2000 to 2003 into this very profitable high-tech security market, which Arizona is also modeling itself on. And so Arizona has sent delegations of lawmakers and technology experts who've traveled to Israel to model laws that have stripped Palestinians of their legal status and controlling their movements through technologies that find this definitive proof lodged in the body's effective signals, turning the fear of the body as weapon, right, the suicide bomber, into the new science of immigration control at the US-Mexico border and beyond. So what's also interesting about these technologies is that Israel has also included an artificial sight computer system that can automatically detect not only bodies that deviate from the norm and the molecular site of the body, but also look at landscapes and detect aberrations to a landscape to see what might be unusual movements. And so this technology has also been taken up and is helping me think about the ways in which this technology and thinking about this hotspot is kind of a new concept, but how certain border crossing zones are really being thought of as these heightened alert zones in need of control where bodies are out of place, wreaking havoc on the Western nation and its citizenry. So attention to the hotspot in the body and within a locational radius opens up what I'm calling the racial massification of border surveillance in which certain bodies already compute threat as bodies in mass. Literally, bodies defined by their fleshy mass, and also bodies that pose a threat to the life of others. Thus, even as surveillance is promoted for its efficient and rapid security of mass of individuals, its logic relies on the abnormality of bodies and spaces that shape the very technological production of what's visible as a threat in the first place. And I guess I am out of time, so thank you.
Hit the right arrow. Okay. Hello. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and really an honor to be in such distinguished company. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you to Catherine for your organizing work. Thank you to the Center for Chicano and Latino Research. And thank you as well, to everyone who put this together. I'm not actually doing a PowerPoint, despite this slide. I do have 2 images that I'm going to show towards the end of my talk. And as you can see from my title, I took very seriously the suggestion that we focus on a keyword, hence I have a 1-word title, deferral. So here goes. Deferral, to defer. 1, to put off, to postpone to a future time, to delay the execution of, to withhold. 2, to render or offer. 3, to lay before, to submit in a respectful manner. 4, to yield deference to the wishes of another, to submit to the opinion of another, or to authority. And that was from Webster's Online Dictionary. In June 2012, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano announced the creation of Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. DACA allows certain undocumented youth who immigrated to the U.S. as children, attended U.S. schools, and lived in the United States continuously since June 2007 to obtain work authorization and temporary relief from deportation. With this announcement, deferred action, a relatively unknown yet not uncommon form of prosecutorial discretion used in immigration proceedings, became part of the public vocabulary. The program went into effect in 2012, and as of December 2015, some 638,000 individuals were approved. Then, in November 2014, President Obama announced the Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, or DAPA program, and he expanded the 2012 DACA program for childhood arrivals. With this, deferred action also became a vehicle through which an estimated 4.4 million undocumented immigrants could potentially regularize their presence in the United States. As I'm sure you all know, their ability to do so has been further deferred through a court injunction imposed after Texas and 25 other states sued the Obama administration, challenging his authority to implement this program. The eventual fate of these programs, which are known as executive relief, will depend not only on the judgment of the courts, but of course also on who assumes the presidency in 2017. So that's my Trump reference. Not a story, but a reference. So in my talk today, I focus on the keyword deferral. I ask, what is signified by the fact that instead of being able to acquire a status that would place them on a path to citizenship, the most that many unauthorized migrants can now hope for is temporary or indefinite deferral of deportation, a non-action that allows them to remain in the United States, but in a highly liminal state? What temporalities are invoked through the postponement of a future action on the grounds of the pasts that non-citizens have accumulated in the United States? Is deferral a form of violence, indeed a rejection or refusal, as suggested by the slogan, "A dream deferred is a dream denied"? Is deferral a new form of subjugation, one that involves deferring to the discretion of an invisible adjudicator whose determination of eligibility is not subject to review? What does it mean when legal relief takes the form of a law enforcement action, when advocacy comes to focus on influencing deportation priorities rather than on securing rights, as Shannon alluded to earlier, and when those who would potentially benefit are positioned as supplicants, requesters seeking consideration? What is the deferral in deferred action? So to consider these questions, I draw on multiple sources. First, I draw on scholarly work as well as a close reading of various texts associated with the 2012 DACA program, including the application form, the frequently asked questions posted on the USCIS website, and so forth. Second, I draw on my experiences in 2012 when DACA was first created, at which time I was shadowing legal service providers and also doing volunteer work in a nonprofit in Los Angeles that provided legal services to Spanish-speaking immigrants. And third, I draw on research regarding DAPA and DACA Plus that I've been conducting with 3 colleagues in the UCI School of Law, Samira Shar, Jennifer Chacon, and Stephen Lee, as well as with 2 doctoral students, Adelina Burciaga and Alma Garza. Altogether, between July 2014 and June 2015, we were able to conduct 16 interviews with advocates affiliated with immigrant-serving organizations, and we also conducted interviews with potential DACA Plus or DAPA applicants, and we're continuing this research now. Together, these materials provide insight into the on-the-ground meanings of deferral, both for non-citizen subjects and for the state to whose discretion these subjects must appeal. So to begin to explicate the deferral entailed in deferred action, it seems logical to begin with origins. So I want to consider 2 questions. First, how can origin be understood within the postponements that are associated with deferral? And second, how did deferred action originate as a legal practice? So to address the first question, I turn to Jacques Derrida's famous essay, Deferral, and I don't speak French, so that's my effort to approximate what I imagine a French accent to be. This can be translated as, among other things, deferral. And this essay is by Derrida is premised on the point that even though they're pronounced the same in French, the word différance, please excuse me, it means actually, has 2 different meanings. It can be spelled A-N-C-E or E-N-C-E, one of which means something like deferral, and the other of which means something like different. So that's what his essay explores, is the relationship between those 2 concepts. And you can see in the case of deferred action that this is true as well. So of course, deferred action entails deferral, but it also creates difference by distinguishing among the population of quote-unquote undocumented people, but also distinguishing among the people who would acquire something akin to status, right? But it's very much, it's not a status technically, and it's very precarious. Derrida describes différance with an A, which I'm equating with deferral, as a negative space and time, quote, a hole with interminable borders, end quote, a detour that suspends the accomplishment or fulfillment of desire or will. In the case of deferred action, both migrants' desire for status and the state's desire to remove them are suspended, producing the conundrum that DACA recipients attain legal presence but not lawful status. Derrida also writes about the importance of the interval in understanding the temporality entailed in a deferral. He points out that there's and if we think about the interval, we can apply that notion to something like deferred action in 2 ways, or DACA in 2 ways. One, the postponement of an action to the future suggests that there's a distinction between past, present, and future, right? So that the interval would be what separates those. And 2, in order to qualify for DACA, one has to prove one's presence in the United States over a particular interval of time, right? So deferred action can therefore be construed, to go back to my question, how do we understand origin? Deferred action can be construed as an origin in that it legalizes presence and carves out a unique population, right, creating difference, but also as non-origin in that it defers action to the future, and as a manipulation of origin in that it brings the past into the present in order to suspend future removal or the creation of new legalization opportunities. Let me turn to the second way that I wanted to talk about origin, namely the historical origins of deferred action as a legal practice. According to a 2013 Congressional Research Service report, prosecutorial discretion derives from the 16th century common law doctrine of nolla prosequi, which gave prosecutors the authority to terminate or simply not pursue criminal or civil proceedings deemed frivolous or unwarranted. Intriguingly, according to legal scholar Shobha Wadia, in the US, historically, the availability of prosecutorial discretion in immigration cases appears to have been something of a secret. She writes that it was not until 1975 when former Beatle John Lennon, who was fighting deportation, submitted a FOIA request inquiring about what was then called the Non-Priority Status Program, that information about this program came to light. After acknowledging the existence of this program, the Immigration Service published guidance documents as part of its operations instructions, bringing the program out of the shadows. These post-1975 documents reveal the liminal nature of deferred action as a program that is law-like, but also differentiated from formal law. One court concluded that it, quote, resembles a substantive provision for relief, but, end quote, yet is not quite such a provision and generally has not been subject to judicial review. Wadia's analysis of the history of these of prosecutorial discretion suggests that there has been a tension between the sense that discretion ought to be exercised in a consistent fashion and the concern that issuing rules about how discretion should operate or establishing categories or groups to which discretion should apply undermines the discretionary nature of and thus the basis for deferred action. How then did the Obama administration navigate these tensions to create a formal deferred action program focusing on a particular group of individuals, namely childhood arrivals? To address this question, I turn now to my reading of a more recent set of administrative guidance documents, namely those that govern the 2012 DACA program. The June 15, 2012 memo that created DACA invoked the complex origins of prosecutorial discretion, carefully distinguishing DACA from a substantive right or law which can only be created by Congress. Creating DACA constituted DHS and thus the US government as a particular kind of authority, one that did not enforce law blindly, but rather would give consideration to individualized circumstances. Within DACA texts, consideration, as opposed to, for example, adjudication, is a technical term, as indicated by the title of the I-821D application form, it's actually a request form, consideration of deferred action for childhood arrivals, through which individuals could solicit DACA. And I went actually and compared the TPS form on which the DACA request form was based, and they change, if you compare the instructions, they've changed the word applicant to requester and things like that across those two forms. Let's see. DACA also sharply distinguishes youth worthy of deferred action from other young people who are not, and against whom the state's enforcement powers are to be deployed. So this is not unlike the paradox that we heard about earlier today between the deportable alien and the protected worker, or between perhaps status and behavior. So on the I-821D form, which you use to apply for DACA, there's a heading. It's called Criminal, National Security, and Public Safety Information. Though one might normally assume that such a heading precedes information about how to stay safe, such as in an earthquake, or when confronted with dangerous criminals, in this section, DACA requesters must report on their own criminal histories, gang membership, participation in torture or genocide, and violence. The DACA requester is thus the potential criminal security and safety threat imagined by these questions. The frequently asked questions for the DACA application process also indicate that DACA requesters will be subject to a background check in which their biometric data will be run against, quote, a variety of databases maintained by DHS and other federal government agencies, end quote. The unspecified nature of these databases could potentially create anxiety among requesters. What information might be recorded about them and where? Another technical component of requesting DACA consists of assembling the evidentiary record needed to prove eligibility. This presents a documentary challenge summarized in the frequently asked question, quote, to prove my continuous residence in the United States since June 15, 2007, must I provide evidence documenting my presence for every day or every month of that period, end quote. One might imagine finer gradations, or every hour or every minute, and so on. In other words, documentation is finite in that it only documents particular temporal moments, whereas the interval to be documented is continuous. In contrast to the careful calculations enabled by the DACA request form, DACA itself is enveloped in an uncertainty that has only grown over time. DACA requesters therefore took some risk in soliciting DACA. In doing so, they had to appeal to an invisible administrator who would evaluate on a case-by-case basis, but in accordance with the criteria set out in the guidance documents, whether they were a low priority for removal and therefore warranted humanitarian consideration. So now I turn to my experience in in 2012 as the DACA program was getting created. The process of filling out the DACA request form and assembling the documentation that accompanies the form illustrates the temporal and legal magic through which deferral takes place. I'm going to focus here both on how the nonprofit, where I was shadowing service providers and doing volunteer work, prepared for DACA, and also the process through which people applied for DACA and prepared DACA requests. So let us return in time to August 2012, just before the DACA program was implemented, when it was still unclear what sort of proof would be required, what the application form would look like, or even, given that President Obama was running for re-election, whether or not this program would survive. U.S. immigration authorities, immigrant serving organizations, and immigrants themselves had been given only 60 days from June 2012, when the program was announced, until August 2012, when it was to be implemented. And this created tremendous pressure at the organization where I was volunteering. One attorney described feeling like there was a DACA-nami, right, like a tsunami, because there was just a tremendous effort that had to be, carried out in the face of great uncertainty. And this created huge tension, not tension, but anxiety among service providers, to the point that some people told me they were even having difficulty sleeping. Now, I was not a service provider, I'm a researcher, and I was a volunteer, but even I found myself, before the DACA program even began, having a DACA nightmare, which I dutifully recorded in my field notes. So here's what I dreamed. This is dangerous to share one's dreams in an audience. I dreamed that I had gone in to volunteer at this agency, and someone had given me an intake form and asked me to complete an application. Sitting at the computer and looking at the intake form, I struggled to complete the DACA application. Again, this is before there was such a thing in my dream. I couldn't figure out whether the birth date had been written in month, day, year, as in English, or in day, month, year, as in Spanish. Then in my dream, I remembered being told to ask the applicant such questions, but where was the applicant? I realized I had been supposed to go get the applicant and have him with me while I filled out the form, so I did so in my dream. I went and called the person's name, and he came forward, and we went together to go back to the room where I'd begun to work on the application, but I couldn't find the room. I kept opening doors and looking in and trying one computer after another, and I kept wandering, and then I woke up. So this dream conveys the way that I, too, became caught up in the anxiety over DACA's impending initiation, and partly it reveals my anxiety over potentially making mistakes, but also the overarching atmosphere of uncertainty, which in my dream was reflected by wandering without being able to find the correct room. Further insight into how the temporal transformation of deferral is accomplished can be gleaned through the following reflection on my experience as a volunteer, working to prepare the DACA request of a 20-year-old man I will refer to as Carlos. This was the second DACA case I helped to prepare. Before I saw him, Carlos had already listened to a presentation on immigration law. He'd been screened by a legal staff member who determined that he was eligible, and he'd been given a list of documents that he was to bring to his appointment. So when I reviewed these documents against the checklist I'd been given, I saw that he was missing one thing, and this was common, actually, it turned out: proof of presence in the United States for the year after he graduated from high school. So I consulted with the legal staff, who advised me that he would need additional documentation to fill that gap. Remember the interval of that problem. When I relayed this staff member's advice to Carlos, he said that he didn't know what documentation he could get because of his undocumented status, living at home, and being paid in cash. He didn't have a bank account, bills in his name, or check stubs. He could not think of anything. Then he said, what about receipts from GameStop? He said that he reserves video games that are about to come out, and then he purchases them. That activity generates receipts with his name on them. It might have saved me, he commented. This detailed example illustrates the temporization and legal magic through which deferral occurs. To defer the future act of deportation, Carlos had to bring his past life forward in time through documents that had recorded the trace of his presence in the United States. The challenge he faced was that for a period of time, his presence may have left no documentable trace, thus raising the possibility that he, in fact, wasn't here. Receipts and other documents issued by random businesses, such as GameStop, also were potentially granted legal authority, as they were repurposed as presence documents. Furthermore, just as soliciting DACA required individuals to return to and bring forward their past lives, there's also a sense in which the deferred action request process invoked earlier legal programs, especially because it built on the TPS form, the Temporary Protected Status form, which was first created in 1990, after a decade of trying to secure some sort of status for Central American refugees in the United States. So this, in some ways, DACA then returned to and brought earlier programs like temporary protected status forward in time, even while the promise of a future large-scale and more robust legalization program was deferred to another moment. And this deferral continues through the current suspension of executive relief. So let me fast forward from August 2012, when DACA was created, to November 2014, and now I'm drawing on my more recent research, when President Obama was about to announce a new form of executive action. Advocates and immigrants had been waiting for this moment for months. In the absence of comprehensive immigration reform, they'd been pressuring the Obama administration to take action independently. And by summer of 2014, there were indications the president was about to do just that, but that's when there was a lot of news coverage of the arrival of unaccompanied minors from Central America, and this announcement got deferred once again. But by November 2014, the president actually scheduled his long-awaited announcement. So to hear it, I joined immigrants and advocates in downtown Los Angeles, where outside of an immigrant detention facility, a huge screen was inflated so that the president's speech could be projected. The mood was festive as a band played, and immigrants and activists circulated, holding signs advocating for immigrants' rights. As night fell and the time for the speech began, people took a seat on the pavement to watch. There we go. So the president appeared on the screen, and as the audience listened, he described the importance of immigration to the United States. After outlining the frustrated efforts to pass comprehensive immigration reform, he described the actions he could legally take as president. He said, first, we'll build on our progress at the border with additional resources for our law enforcement personnel so that they can stem the flow of illegal crossings and speed the return of those who do cross over. This announcement led to boos from the crowd where I was sitting. He then went on and he made the point that he was going to recalibrate enforcement activities to focus on felons, not families, as we've just heard. And he offered undocumented immigrants what he described as a deal. He said, if you've been in America for more than 5 years, if you have children who are American citizens or legal residents, if you register, pass a criminal background check, and you're willing to pay your fair share of taxes, you'll be able to stay in this country temporarily without fear of deportation. You can come out of the shadows and get right with the law. That's what this deal is. The crowd that was gathered in downtown Los Angeles sat silently as the president continued talking. Instead of the cheers that could have accompanied this announcement, there seemed to be a stunned silence. In fact, as the president signed off by saying, "God bless you and God bless this country we love," there were some boos. While the details of this deal were still unclear, the fact that the parents of DACA recipients were not included appeared to many to be a major omission. Yet while the crowd in downtown Los Angeles had a mixed reaction to the announcement of executive relief, some immigrants who would qualify were elated. In the days prior to the announcement, we had interviewed Alondra, that's a pseudonym, a Peruvian woman who'd immigrated on an employment visa, stayed beyond the expiration date, and she'd become undocumented. In her interview, she had described to us how she and her family had experienced deeply humiliating discrimination that she attributed both to being Latina and due to their immigration status. The day after Obama's announcement, however, Alondra emailed us to say what the announcement meant to her. She wrote, "Yesterday I heard President Obama's message. Finally, one feels relief. It is like being able to take a breath after having been drowning. I believe that things will be different from now on. There are many projects in our minds and an incredible optimism. We still have a little fear, and that is normal, but the desire to do what it takes to get residency is strong." And like Alondra, many who anticipated qualifying for DACA Plus and DAPA began to make plans. We interviewed individuals in the months following the announcement, and they told us of the differences that they thought deferred action would take in their lives. But let's fast forward again to February 17th, 2015. And on that day, a member of our research team was driving to a nonprofit agency to attend their staff training on preparing DACA Plus applications. Her notes read that on this date, the community organization held one of a series of trainings in preparation to get ready for the clients they expected to receive. They planned to begin assisting clients on their applications the next day, February 18th. On my drive into the training, however, I learned a federal judge had just the night before ruled against the enforcement of these executive actions. I wondered how prominent this news would be at the training. And indeed, the injunction appeared to come as a shock to many advocates and immigrants. Following the injunction, we contacted would-be DACA Plus and DAPA applicants who had previously interviewed to ask about their experiences and expectations. One of those people we called back after the injunction was Armenia, who had originally immigrated to the United States from Mexico at the age of 13. At the time of our original interview before the injunction, she told us that she was ineligible for the 2012 DACA program due to being over 31 at the time that it was announced. But DACA Plus lifted this age restriction, so she anticipated being eligible to apply. With DACA Plus, she hoped to return to school, complete her degree in biology, and obtain a job that was commensurate with her training. She commented, "I think I have the potential to do something better with my life. I just hope it's not too late." But in contrast to this sense of hope, when we spoke with her again after the injunction, she expressed bitter disappointment. She told us, "When it was suspended, all of my hopes fell. I was very disappointed. I thought that the president had the power to act, and that was what it was, an executive action. I was taken by surprise that a single judge in Texas could suspend an order that had been issued by the president. I was very disappointed. I was ready. I had gotten all of my paperwork in order and was preparing to apply as soon as the program opened. It is very, very frustrating. I had waited so long, and then finally there was a small light, like at the end of a tunnel, and then it went out suddenly. So I'm just waiting. With the suspension, my hopes too were suspended." So this account of the announcement and then suspension of executive relief demonstrates the legal violence of deferred action. Lacey Abrego, who's here, and Cecilia Menjivar use the term legal violence to refer to, quote, "the harmful effects of the law that can potentially obstruct and derail immigrants' plans of incorporation." They further note that while it may not be immediately physically damaging, legal violence can cause immediate pain while also being, quote, "potentially harmful for long term," end quote. So the deferral of the ability to regularize thus is a form of violence. If the original announcement of deferred action enabled a drowning person to breathe, to recall Alondra's words, even as it perhaps left other people still drowning, then the injunction has taken away this life-giving breath. Likewise, Armenia described the injunction as creating darkness, suspending hope, and disrupting plans. Understanding such violence is key to delineating the subjects to which deferred action gives rise. Oh no, I don't know if you can see that. It didn't come out so well in a slide. Can you see it? Okay, so I'm concluding. So what I want to do at the end here is to reflect on what this account that I've provided tells us about what I'm calling the discretionary state on the one hand and the transitory subject on the other. And I think these terms may echo with some of the other kinds of terms that we heard earlier today, such as serial labor migration, although the actual migrant experience is quite different from what was described earlier. So on the one hand, if you look at the discretionary state, right, it has the power to decide, whereas what we see in the DACA application materials is that the transitory subject, is positioned as a supplicant who's attempting to sway this power. The discretionary state is invisible, yet very omnipresent, right? As we saw from, the people don't actually confront the person who would make a decision in their application, so there's invisible presence, but may have information about them in the state's databases. The transitory subject is in a negative time and space, right? As I drew on this notion from Derrida, right, of the negative time and space, and you can see this transitory subject who would be potentially imagined for applying for deferred action is a non-priority, they have a non-status, right? And then they're enveloped in uncertainty, right? So that's this negative time and space. Performatively, the discretionary state is brought into being through the exercise of discretion, and we see that in the memo that I quoted earlier from Janet Napolitano about how the state doesn't have to enforce the law blindly, and we see that the transitory subject is made visible through documentation, as in the case of Carlos trying to document his life. the discretionary state is fragmented, right? A single judge in Texas can disagree with the president. The transitory subject can also disappear. So DAPA, even though it was announced, people have not yet even been able to appear through DAPA, right? And their futures are uncertain. And also the instructions say this can be revoked at any time, rescinded. The discretionary state's unstable, right? We've seen that. We don't know what will happen in the future if depending on who's elected, we don't know what will happen. Likewise, the transitory subject takes on risks and is insecure. The discretionary state is law-like. Remember that quote that it resembles a statutory provision, but is not quite that. Likewise, the transitory subject is quasi-legal. People attain lawful presence, but not lawful status. And so just to conclude, the very last thing I wanted to say is it's not yet clear what the rise of or the increased prominence of what I'm calling here the discretionary state and the transitory subject imply for citizenship itself. But I'm going to defer answering that question to, and I'm not going to defer action, I'm going to defer answering that question to a future moment as my colleagues and I are continuing to do research on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up the floor to questions so that we can spend as much of the remaining time that we have on bringing in the audience into our conversation and then continuing the incredibly rich set of inquiries that our panelists have provided. So are there questions? And then Kat will come around with the microphone.
One?
I basically because I already asked one. Okay. So this is a comment that might be a question for the panel, and it has to do with if I want to ground it onto something Felicity said about the hot spots and bodies out of place, but also applies to Lisa's distinction between behavior and being, and it has to do with this quasi-presence, this quasi-legality, this legality that is closer to a fiction, this semi-status of being, this semi-presence is literalized in DACA and DAPA, and they can go no farther than the reality, and in that sense, they are telling us the truth, and this is something I'm going to talk about tomorrow, but they are telling us the truth about the way we live in the U.S. The one thing I wanted to add to this was that the status and the way in which the body is read, the body of the racialized other in the U.S., is also context and time dependent. It's not exclusively based on the physiognomy, on the appearance of the body. It is also about being in place or out of place. So the same person who, while performing services, providing services to the mainstream, is seen as in place, is the same person who later in the evening, walking on the street, will be perceived as out of place. The same person who is vital by providing the services that the economy needs and that the people need, by providing care for kids or older people or cleaning bathrooms or preparing the meals we eat, is the same person that is perceived as out of place and illegal once that person is walking down the street after having worked in a affluent neighborhood, because this person does not belong there. So I just wanted to add that comment about how DACA, DAPA, and this quasi-legal status tell us something about the truth about the way we live, and this secondary comment about how that truth is always context dependent and it varies.
I just want to thank you for that comment. I think that is very astute. observation. And it reminds me a little of when I was talking with some students, they were trying to figure out whether or not they even wanted to apply for DACA, because they were thinking, okay, this moment now, I might be seen like context dependent as like legal, or potentially, or have a temporary legal status, but they were thinking about their context of the future, right? Like, is this going to be a path to legalization or a path to deportation? Do I want to put all of my information, and be under surveillance in this way? So it's almost like they felt like they were giving up a piece of the limited freedom that being undocumented had given them. So thank you so much for the comment.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to also get at was thinking about the ways in which we've come back around to the idea of race as biological through these technologies that are trying to fix bodies within particular ways of knowing that then get translated back into a database that sticks who they are, that information in a database that could be recalled at any time, so that someone could be seen as a potentially dangerous person in a database. That information can be used over and over in the same way that if you're undocumented and you commit any infraction of a crime, no matter what it was categorized at the time it was done, if you get caught doing something else and that infraction changed, you're still going to be a criminal. That status sticks with you across time. Unlike citizens when you commit a crime, that status will leave after 7 years. It's off the records. So I think, you're definitely onto something in terms of, thinking about how for particular populations, they're stuck in a particular way of thinking of time and place. And even the thinking of the body through the primitive is also controlling the time of how we understand these bodies as always unable to be modernized, and, all those tropes. So, yeah.
I don't know. In the interviews that we've been doing, one thing that we've been struck by, and this is not at all surprising, is the degree to which people are telling us about their efforts to perform citizenship. They don't call it that, but they talk about, their efforts to drive in a certain way, walk in a certain way, do things that they think deliberately. I mean, they mention this, like when we ask questions like, are you concerned about the authorities in your neighborhood? And they'll say, well, no, because I don't think I would be pulled over. I don't think I would be stopped. Of course, we've also heard many accounts of people getting pulled over, stopped, questioned, and profiled, right? But some people, they talk about their strategies, their bodily strategies to try to avoid being profiled in that way through their behavior, right? So that's one thing. And I guess I also was thinking about the notion of databases and the way that sometimes people imagine certain records are going to be held against them in ways that they won't, So there's sort of like there can be an overreaction. So someone has a debt. One woman we interviewed, she owed money to a hospital for medical procedures that she'd obtained since she didn't have insurance. And so she was saying that she was really concerned about applying for something like DACA or DAPA because of the debt she owed the hospital. So this was, or a lot of women, so this is very gendered too, talk about having received some kind of public assistance, and they're really worried that that's going to be held against them. Where to my knowledge, I'm not an attorney, to my knowledge, that isn't even looked at for those particular things, for DACA at least.
Thank you all for a fantastic panel. This question is for Susan, and I wondered if you could...
Oh, hi.
Hey, Susan.
Sorry,
Hey, Susan, this is Shannon. I wondered if you could say a little bit, drawing on your expertise from the Central American case. And what I wanted is a two-part thing. One, if you could talk a little bit about the role of collective action in ensuring sustained rights. So if we look at kind of the emergence and sustaining of TPS and the role of the advocacy in Central American communities, and we can extend that to other TPS recipients. So how that gives us any insight into how DACA might continue to be sustained. So for those of you, maybe you can explain how TPS has had this ongoing renewals that really is based on the ability of the advocacy community's ability to continue to pressure Congress to keep it renewed. So what can we learn from that? And then also drawing on Steve McKay's discussion about the importance of brokers, what can we learn about from the experience of IRCA, 245I, TPS, all of those large programs in terms of how these brokers are drawing on this past expertise and community access and political savvy to make the current regime a reality?
Okay. There's a long answer to the first question, so I won't go into too much detail, and there's other people here who also have this expertise as well. But in terms of collective action, there's a lot of, when temporary protected status was first created in, I believe, 1990 Immigration Act, then, the first group that it was applied to was Salvadorans who were given 18 months of protected status. And then immediately, organizations formed committees, which then became, independent organizations in some cases, working on the question of renewal. Because there were debates then about to apply or not to apply, right? Because what happens when the 18 months is up? And this was a new status at that time, so people didn't really have. Now, there's been a history of TPS often gets renewed, like once it's given to a group. But at that time, it wasn't really known what was going to happen. So there was a lot of work around that, a lot of pressure. And I believe that's when it was changed to deferred enforced departure status, if I'm remembering correctly, in the case of Salvadorans, if I'm remembering my timelines. And then there was also, at the same time, there had been a lot of work on behalf of asylum seekers from Central America, which had resulted in, well, there was the sanctuary movement in the United States, and then there was a lawsuit, American Baptist Churches versus Thornburg, and a lot of different things happened. So there was legal advocacy as well as mobilizing, as well as organizing. A lot of different types of actions took place. Long story short, 1996 immigration reform happened, and 8 American Baptist Churches versus Thornburg class members a coalition was formed which transcended political sides, right? So there was an alliance between Nicaraguan, Salvadoran, and Guatemalan people who would have benefited, the beneficiaries of the Nicaraguan Review Program and the beneficiaries of the American Baptist Churches versus Thornburg case, which focused on Salvadorans and Guatemalans. So one point there was this key alliance made that crossed political boundaries. That appealed to both Republicans and Democrats, and so that was what enabled the Nicaraguan Adjustment and Central American Relief Act to get passed only 1 year after the 1996 reform. So that was like a really abbreviated answer to your question, but it was a combination of legal actions. It was a combination of lobbying and rallies and all kinds of things, and also it was a huge effort mobilizing Central American governments, to advocate on this as well. Crossing political boundaries, so it took a lot. So I don't really know what the lessons are going forward, but that's what happened in the past. And then as far as brokers, probably more about this than I do, or as much. But anyway, what's happening right now, I think, around DACA and DAPA is that organizations are trying to deal with the fact that, well, first of all, there's tremendous uncertainty, as we all know, about what's going to happen going forward. And so the question is, what do you do as an organization? I think one thing that happened was right after the injunction, some organizations were telling people, oh, this is just going to be brief, don't worry, it's a pause, that term was used. But then it wasn't, right? The injunction still turns out to be with us today. So, that raises issues of credibility for organizations in working with the populations they're working with, right? Because they said it's just going to be a pause, but it extended. And what I've seen more recently is organizations trying to continue to educate people about DACA and DAPA, continuing to educate them that DACA itself still does exist, even though the expanded version, so trying to counter misconceptions, trying to fight against the problem of fraud, where people are being deluded into thinking they cannot apply now when there's no application process, and then helping people to be prepared so that if it is, if the injunction is lifted, people can go forward. So there's a lot of efforts to tell people, go now, get your passport renewed if you need to, so that all your documents are ready, get them now, so that if the injunction is lifted and there's an opportunity to go forward, that you can be prepared and you can do it.
Thank you all. Those were really wonderful presentations. My question is based on research that I've been doing with DACA recipients and their families, and the ways that different people come to understand what it means, what it represents in their lives, and the mostly beneficial outcomes of it so far, right? And I agree that there is a form of, like, if we think about Lisa's work and social death and, you know, all of that in creating more categories of deservingness and exclusion. And I also believe that there's legal violence going on as well, but then how do we reconcile those notions with the fact that in their lived experiences, people see these as wins, right? And activists fought for this and very consciously decided that they weren't pushing for comprehensive immigration reform anymore, that they really just wanted a work permit and a driver's license. And these are small wins that they hope will be incremental wins. So how do we reconcile, I guess, the theory of it versus the lived experience of it? And this is, you know, hopefully just something to think about, because I'm always thinking about these things.
Just quickly, I think when I was using the legal violence quote, I was referring to the deferral of deferred action, like the deferral of the deferral. So in particular, the injunction. One could also argue that the failure to grant, you know, to have a more inclusive program, like the quote that I read about, you know, someone felt like she was, you know, she was getting breath after being drowning. Well, then there's other people that don't get that breath, right? But I didn't mean to imply that deferred action itself is violence. I mean, one could probably see aspects of it as that, you know, having to conform, for example, to, you know, what?
Military.
Yeah, well, that, yeah, but most people, true, the military part, but also having to conform to the requirements. But I was really bringing in your work in that quote to refer to specifically the injunction, the deferral of the deferral.
I don't try to reconcile. I actually am fine with, I'm fine with living with lots of contradictions. So I like to imagine a much better world, and to do that kind of had to tear apart this one because it kind of sucks. But but on the other hand, you know, I understand that there's a lot of things that we have to do politically that are strategic, even if harmful to some populations, and I'm not going to, you know, judge population. I mean, I feel like the kind of work that I try to do is actually to try to understand why it is that the most disempowered and the most vulnerable populations have to use those strategies, right? So I believe they have to use those strategies. I don't want to condemn them because they have to use them, but what I want to try to rethink is why they have to use them, right? So rather than focusing on how do they talk about things differently, or should they do something different, right? Like, those are activists. They have a much different job than me. Like, my job, right, is to dismantle that, or is to try to work with students who and maybe not just students, but, you know, like the general public that only lets us think about things as criminal, non-criminal, right? And so, but does that kind of make sense? It's like, I don't actually think it's important to reconcile that. I think it's fine to allow activists to do what they need to do, but at the same time to try to imagine really radical approaches, like, what about giving back indigenous nations their own nations, and then have different kinds of understandings of borders in that way? You know, so to just even think about things that we just can't actually think about as possibilities, right? Sometimes we have to not think about what's practical. So I think in that way I want both. So.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. One last little comment, and then we need to wrap it up.
Oh, just substituting DACA for passing the DREAM Act, right? And not substituting, you know, it's obviously it's not as full of a measure, but that's also another aspect of the disadvantageous nature of it.
Okay, well, we've run out of time, but I'd like to thank our panelists and also for our audience members as well. This is a very stimulating conversation. Thank you.
And thank you to Professor Arredondo. We're going to take a really brief break, and we have coffee and tea and cookies. We will reconvene.